When we look back at the golden age of children's literature, the popular myth usually involves a solitary adult genius dreaming up magical worlds for wide eyed kids. Today's guest at Anticlockwise, Dr. Victoria Ford Smith, in her brilliant book Between Generations, challenges that dynamic, revealing that children are not just silent muses, but they are active authors, critics, and collaborators who fundamentally shaped the stories we grew up on. She's an associate professor at the University of Connecticut and the co host of the Children's Table podcast, where she has unpacked how ideas like the spooky child or the happy school days are constructed, and what are the cultural currencies or costs of these constructions. So let's go to Victoria and hear about her truly exciting research on the child and childhood. Hi, Victoria. Welcome to the podcast. Oh, Victoria, you have worked for quite some time, like your entire career, on the child artist, children's literature in general, and the child artist in particular. So, what would you say you have found to be the central tension between the child as a construct, which is what people see the child as, authors or readers, and the child as a creator, as someone who is themselves generally engaged in the work of production of art behind the scenes or sometimes not behind the scenes. So, can you tell us a little bit about the child's artistic agency?
Yeah, absolutely. And first, thank you so much for inviting me onto your awesome podcast. I'm very excited to be a guest. Yeah, so I find child artists to be this really interesting way into thinking about how we imagine childhood in general across a lot of contexts. I think most of the time when people have ideas about child artists, when they're imagining them, when they're thinking about them as like a construct, a cultural construct, they're imagining a figure that's really innocent and naive. There's a big investment in child artists as figures who are able to access things that adults no longer can. There's this kind of like purity in child art. So the modernists really love child artists, and they're a great example of this because they say that children are um, closer to God, closer to nature. Um, Child art was a big part of modernists' interest in primitive, in scare quotes, art. And so that construct is trying to get at the idea of childhood as somehow separate from and preserved from adulthood and experience. And I think that's super interesting because it's really a misunderstanding of childhood and how human beings actually work. And it also strips children who are creating art of any kind of, as you mentioned, agency or decision making or intention in their art making. Um, there's no sense, there isn't a sense that children are social creatures living in the world who want to make art that is interesting and engaging with the things, with the world. And I also think that the idea that adults have a type of artistic agency that children don't is just a misunderstanding of agency more broadly. Agency is not the same thing as independence, right? You can collaborate, you can learn from people and still have artistic agency. So pretty much anyone who creates a piece of art is
Mhm.
in conversation with a lot of different forces, just like kids are, right? So it's kind of me trying to pull kid artists
Mhm.
into a sense of their creation rather than being trapped in this static idea of childhood innocence.
So this is very different from the romantic idea of childhood, right? So did you have like an aha moment when you just saw that, oh my God, this is so different from how generally, because we also have in the present day, a lot of people, they still see children in the same way, very
Mhm,
innocent. They are not exposed to all sorts of things in the curricula, for example, in schools.
mhm.
So did you have a particular like aha moment that, okay, this is all very different in reality?
Yeah, I think I had two kind of paired moments. I'm glad you mentioned romantic childhood because I think, and how persistent it is today, because it's one of the most influential ways we think about kids. Like if you ask somebody, what is a child? One of the first things they say is a child's innocent. And my next question is always, have you met a child? Like they're they are not always all that innocent. But I think I had these two moments with this current project. One was I was reading an article saying, oh, this modernist artist was inspired by this archive of child art that he had collected and putting the art side by side and saying, oh, but the child did not make this on purpose, and the adult artist made their painting with intention. And there was no idea that they had to actually think about whether or not a child would have intention, and it seems very likely that children do have intentions when they create art. So that assumption was super interesting to me.
Mhm.
But the other moment was I ran across I was in an archive looking at examples of child art, and a lot of the writing about child artists from the child construct point of view is saying, they don't even need an eraser. Like they just work straight to the paper. And I flipped over the piece of art I was looking for, and there were three attempts right
Oh,
before the
wow.
final. Right. So obviously they had been like thinking and didn't like what they created for some reason and flipped it
Yeah.
over and started over again. So yeah, I'm like, well, that shows some thoughtfulness, right?
Yeah.
And not this like inspiration from God type of art creating.
Yeah, yeah. So they are very intentional about themselves as artists as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So about your book, you have this monograph called Between Generations, Collaborative Authorship in the Golden Age of Children's Literature. So first of all, the Golden Age, it sort of highlights how children were often more than just passive auditors, and they were, even when they were not directly co-authoring. So of the several examples that you have mentioned in the book, do you have any favorite, something that you particularly liked, enjoyed writing about, and if you could share it with the audience and also tell us a little bit more about the golden age of children's literature.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I'll start with the second question as some context. So the golden age of children's literature, I don't love ideas of golden ages because it's like it feels gatekeepy to me, like we're keeping some things out and letting some things through. But it's typically considered from like mid 19th century to about World War One. And it's a moment in the history of children's literature when a lot of what we consider classics of children's lit were created. So Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland or J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan. Um, up to Winnie the Pooh is kind of like Winnie the Pooh is kind of like a later text in that window. But because I say it's gatekeepy because a lot of those authors are like white British, like authors writing for white British children. And so it doesn't take into account the real geographic and just all the kinds of diversity that actually make up children's texts. But because these are such big texts in the children's lit canon, these authors like Lewis Carroll or Edward Lear or J.M. Barrie are often considered these kind of like romantic authors who can tap into the childlike spirit and create these works of lit for kids. And so my book thinks about, well, they are not writing in a vacuum, and they are often writing alongside or in conversation with children. They're part of a culture that was starting to consider children as independent subjects. So we're like leading up to like Freud or child psychology. Um, and so I found all these great examples of adult child collaborations that were both in books and kind of around books. So my favorite example is with Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote Treasure Island and Kidnapped and Jekyll and Hyde. Um, he had a great collaboration with his stepson to create Treasure Island, and I chart that. But my favorite collaboration with them has nothing to do with Treasure Island, and it's instead their collaboration over a toy press, which is a really popular toy for especially for boys in the 19th century. So they would create these like little books of poetry and family newspapers together using a toy press. And I love that example because uh, it's an example of children adopting forms often associated with adults, like the book of poetry or the newspaper. Um, but it's also the toy press world is actually enormous. I discovered there are these huge organizations of boy press owners. They had formal officers and meetings. And so it's a real demonstration of how like this one relationship between Stevenson and his stepson, whose name was Lloyd Osborne, seems like one kind of idiosyncratic familial thing, but in fact is part of a larger cultural movement that was recognizing children as creators. So it kind of shows the stakes a little bit of the argument.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Um,
Yeah, I have a question regarding this idea of collaboration that you were talking about, which is really fascinating. So you use this phrase, I think, called composition narratives in
Mm-hmm,
your book to talk about assemblages of how the creative process or the authorial process actually took place.
mm-hmm.
So how does your idea of this kind of a collaborative authorship transform the idea of authorship itself beyond children's literature? Because I'm thinking
Mm-hmm.
of kind of Foucault or Barthes, and how
Uh-huh.
does your work kind of transform that sense of the author?
Sure. That's a great question. Thank you. I think with the phrase composition narrative and looking at these collaborations, I wanted to pick at authorship in two ways. And one of them is in this kind of like Foucauldian way, that, the single author is actually a very complicated figure, right? And there's lots of um, ways that that author exists at the nexus of like publishers and public and all kinds of influences. And so like just recognizing collaboration as a part of an authorship process and undoing this romantic idea of the single author writing alone inspired, I think is always good work, because we're all writers. We know that that's not really how authorship technically works. But I wanted to call them composition narratives because the reality of that collaboration and what I can find out about it exists alongside these really powerful stories of what authorship is and what stories we tell about it. It might be particularly strong in children's books. I'm not positive that's true, but for example, J.M. Barrie writing Peter Pan, he's writing Peter Pan for these four boys who were a really big presence in his life. And so it becomes impossible to talk about the creation of that text without taking into account this mythology around Barrie and the Llewellyn Davies brothers. And so it's like I have to think about how those two, like the reality and the story, are working together. And so I think if I had to, I don't know if I want to give myself a whole lot of credit about changing ideas of authorship, but I think that's part of it, that a recognition of how authorship works alongside the stories that we tell about authors and about the lives they lead and the people they write for.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go beyond for a little bit beyond your written work. So you have also co-hosted the Children's Table podcast.
It's beautiful, by the way.
It's really great.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
the artwork and the whole website.
Yeah,
And
it
everything.
was so good. Like it's a very good podcast. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, we
The
should
children's
continue.
table, yes.
Yeah, but so how do you kind of perceive this form of media? Because we are also podcasting, and there is now this kind of seemingly a spate about public humanities and public scholarship in general. So how do you think of public humanities or a specific form of the podcast in advancing the field of children's literature and childhood studies in general, and making people aware of the complicated nature of childhood and so on?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I was so happy to learn about your podcast, because I'm sure we agree that like it's really valuable translating your academic and scholarly life into an outward facing format. It's challenging in these really cool ways. So I think everyone should do it. But I think that there are really particular advantages for my field in thinking about it through a public humanities lens. One is that children's lit in childhood, there's something that everyone was a child. So everybody has at least some experience with childhood. Most people know a little bit about children's literature. They're initially very non-threatening subjects. And so if somebody is going to, if I'm trying to communicate to somebody who wants to like try out really critical thinking and like, well, what is academia doing over there? Childhood and children's lit is a good starting place, because I can be like, we all know, like we know who Peter Pan is. So I can talk about Peter Pan. And so that's really helpful. But at the same time, that children's lit feels really accessible and childhood might feel really accessible. Children's lit and childhood are at the center of so many things happening right now in the world, in terms of censorship, in terms of education, as Ashmina mentioned at the beginning, and thinking about free speech, thinking about parents' rights, thinking about how we talk about gender and sexuality in general and to young people. And so it feels like a kind of, at first, maybe fun or trivial topic, but actually very quickly becomes quite serious. And so doing a podcast about it helps us invite people into that conversation to realize the long histories of some of the things that we're talking about right now. And also forces scholars in my field to think about, how can I connect what I do? And I work on the 19th century, right? To what's happening right now in Florida, or what's happening, on a school board, or what my education students are dealing with when they go get jobs. So I think it's like sneakily very difficult. It seems easy, but then it becomes very relevant and pretty serious quite fast.
Yeah,
Absolutely,
I
yeah.
agree. In fact, one of the favorite parts of your podcast was the spooky section, the spooky kids section of it, and especially because we on our podcast, I don't know if you have been through some of those. We are obsessed about everything that is gothic and spooky. It's kind of not just because Halloween, but also it's always spooky season on our podcast. So we basically already asked Victoria, by the way, just to my viewers, that we asked her to come prepared with a spooky story. So firstly, what makes kids, Victorian or otherwise, why are they spooky in the first place? Why are they creepy? And secondly, tell us a Victorian, or maybe not a Victorian, spooky kid story.
Yeah, I love this question. I also love spooky things. Why are Victorian kids spooky? I mean, I feel like kids in general are used to make things spooky. Like when you're watching a horror movie, if, like the soundtrack turns to children singing, like something really, really evil is about to happen. And I think part of it, well, with kids in general, I think it's because of this construction actually that I was talking about before, that kids are innocent or kids are pure. And so it's the dissonance between something truly harrowing and something that we consider very safe, that misalignment, like the jarring feeling of those two things coming together that I think can be really scary. I also just think Victorian, like we think about Victorians as being very weird. And they were very weird in some ways. Like they did weird stuff. When somebody died, they used to wear their hair in jewelry, right? Like, and so there's like weird things Victorians did. They seem very foreign to the contemporary moment. And so if you put like a child in a Victorian orphan costume, there's a ghost, right? It feels very strange. Um, as far as spooky Victorian stories, I do have like a secondary research interest that I've written a little bit about on child mediums, like kids who talk to dead people, um, which has been really fun to research. And probably the most famous child mediums are the Fox sisters, who were actually American in the 19th century. And they would talk to ghosts by asking them questions, and then it was like spirit rapping, like they heard knocks in response. And it was all proved to be a hoax, later, of course. Um, but I got really into child mediums, and I found this girl named Nellie Temple who was really famous in New England in the mid 1800s. Um, and she would talk to these enormous revivals of people, these tent revivals of spiritualists, and channel the dead and kind of talk to them from the spirit realm. What she said wasn't that spooky. I mean, I was hoping for something really weird, but it's mostly like beware the wrath of God type of things, which can be scary. Um, but what I love about her is that she was like 14, I think, by the time she was really drawing crowds at revivals, but they still talk about her like she's a little girl. So they're like, she's playing with her dolls and she has her short frock on. Um, and so they're trying to make her very childlike to up the spooky factor, right? And like, look at this little girl who can talk to ghosts. When in fact she was like, by that time, like she was kind of a young woman. So spooky child, but also spookily indicative of the weird way we think about kids.
Yeah, and that still kind of works, right? We have all these movies like The Sixth Sense, or
Yeah.
yeah, a child talks to spirits and that sort of
Yeah.
thing.
Like kids can see
And
ghosts when we can't. Yeah.
yeah, and that also takes sometimes a really gruesome form, I would say. Like we are thinking about Stranger Things a lot these days
Hmm.
because we have the last season coming. And there also, the whole series sort of begins with one child being abducted by something that is evil. So somehow
Hmm.
children are more susceptible to uh, evil or forces which are not benign.
Yeah.
Um,
Like they're vulnerable.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, maybe in some ways, I mean, for Victorian children, they are closer to spirits somehow, so
Hmm.
surrounded by fairies or
Uh-huh.
thinking of the Rossetti poems, so somehow they can perceive entities which adults cannot. So that
Yeah.
also probably makes them kind of
Oh
spooky.
yeah, Goblin Market.
Yeah, Goblin Market.
Yeah. Oh, I love that poem. But also, like, I'm glad you brought up fairies because I think I like the child medium example, because the Fox sisters were fooling everyone.
Mhm.
And then the fairy thing, I don't know if you've heard of the Cottingley fairy photographs, but these little girls took photographs with fairies, and 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 many people believe that they were taking pictures of fairies, including Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who writes Sherlock Holmes, and like you think that he
Okay.
would have a more discerning mind. But I mean, I like those examples because those children, and there's a way to understand it, that they knew that adults would assume that kids can see fairies, and they took advantage of that, right? And they kind of exploited that construct. And it's just like, I don't know, kids are always smarter than we give them credit for.
Yeah. So do you think that also adults like the idea of having sort of an ideal child to, I don't know, not look up to maybe, but also have as an example for their children maybe or for future generations?
I mean, yes, I'm gonna go really cynical with this, which is, I feel bad about this, but like we just use children in that way, to support certain ideas and ideologies. So, using children to think about white privilege, or I mean, they're not saying that out loud, but what is the perfect, like Gerber baby, right? With baby contests, what types of childhood do we find to be ideal children that we want our children to be, children to look up to? Protecting the children is a really powerful rhetoric for politicians and policymakers. Um, and so I think we do set up children as ideals, but there's usually an agenda behind the types of children that we put in that role.
Yeah,
Yeah, especially ideologies of boyhood in the Victorian period, Imperial boyhood, who people
Mm-hmm.
who will be sent back to England initially because like colonial settings are not suitable for childhood, but then they
Right.
will come back when they are kind of prepared to be imperialists. So there are all these
Absolutely.
different kind of using innocence in certain ways. And then also I'm thinking of examples like Kim, where
Mm-hmm.
Kim is like a boy, but also he was raised in India and he kind of has some Indian diseases. I work on
Mm-hmm.
diseases, so I'm
Oh,
thinking from
interesting.
those,
Yeah.
yeah, perspectives. Um, so yeah, like using these different attributes of the child to forward different kinds of ideologies, or making these kind of composite ideologies of the
Mm-hmm.
nation or the empire and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know, I don't remember if we read Kim together as Rita, but
yes, we
I
did.
also find, yeah, Kim is so fascinating too, because Kim is this hybrid character, right? I think he's Anglo-Indian Irish.
Mhm.
And so like he can adapt to these different situations. And then sometimes he's like the white child, and sometimes he's not the white child. Sometimes he's the imperialist, and sometimes he's the imperial subject. So
Captures so much. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, it's just like that novel. I need to reread it now that I'm talking about it.
Yeah, as part of that class, one of my favorite sections was about masculinity and how school education, such as Boy Scout trainings and so on, have been influential in developing notions of masculinity very early in life. And also how class and race could influence these notions. And I know that you also later on went on to offer, I think, a graduate course on this very topic. So I am curious to know if you have anything to say about these things, ideas of masculinity and femininity, especially because they are affecting children so much today. In the present day, we all hear about this carnivore diets that people are getting into, and then there's also the trad wife roles and so on, traditional family roles, which are sort of inculcated early in life. So would you want to say something more on these things, how ideas of masculinity or femininity came about and how they are directed towards educating children?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, I'm drawn to talking about scouting, which we mentioned already. Um, and looking at the origins of the Boy Scouting movement, I think is really instructive, and in the way that you outlined kind of in your question, because it's shaping generations of boys in the early 1900s, and of course to the present. But it's doing so through very particular ideas of who a boy is,
Mhm.
and a boy's duty. And I mean who a boy is in terms um, of race, because these are boys of empire who will go to India, as you mentioned, right? Later as kind of colonial officers or something like that. The lore, the stories in the scouting manual are often based in literature of war or of colonization by Robert Baden-Powell, like the Siege of King or other kind of conflicts. And so there's this like history, right, of the way we imagine masculinity and femininity and boyhood and girlhood are so implicated in the national project of wherever they're coming from, right? Um, I think that it's useful to keep that in mind. That feels really far away now, maybe, but it's still so active in the way that we talk to boys and girls. Um, just the other day in my undergraduate class, we were talking about Girl Guides, which is Agnes Baden Powell's response to Boy Scouting. So Robert Baden Powell's sister Agnes, um, and it's a really, I think it's a useful example now because Robert Baden-Powell really didn't want Girl Guides. He was like, scouting is a masculine activity. But then he discovered that all these girls were doing it anyway, pretty much like without his permission. And sometimes they would even earn badges and send in for them and just not use their first name. So he would not know they were girls. And he was like, please, no, scouting is for boys. Like, this is a masculine activity. But he finally was approached at the first, like, kind of scout jamboree by a group of girls who had created their own uniforms and who were, like, very organized. And he eventually was like, okay, fine. So we're going to make their Girl Guides. But then when they make the Girl Guides, their manual is so traditionally, like, it's traditional feminine values in the guise of a scouting manual. So like he's like, women can't be scouts, women can be guides. Scouting is dangerous and vulnerable and risky. Guides are support and nurturance. And so when you cook a meal at camp or take care of someone, you're being a girl guide. So it's using the same structure to like continue the gender differentiation. But I like the example today because it's like, if you're a kid today, you're getting all kinds of messages about what it means to be a boy or a girl. And those are really powerful and they have a really long history. And the people telling you what you're supposed to do are not necessarily looking out for your good. They're looking out for some other agenda, for an idea of nationhood or an idea of race. But you can be like that middle girl guide and do your own thing without anyone's permission, right? Like they were doing it without permission. And those rogue girl guides, I think, are the sweet spot, right? Because they're like, I'm going to use the tools you're giving me to forge my own way into being a girl, right? And so there's hope amid all of the ridiculous, sexist, misogynistic, racist stuff. Like their kids can use those materials and do something much better with them than the adults had planned. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. And see, you didn't end up being cynical at all.
Yeah, that was hopeful. Look at me being hopeful.
Okay.
Yeah. So kind of that brings us towards closer to the end of our questions. So your current book project is called Small Modernisms. So I'm just intrigued to learn about it. And could you tell us a little more about it and how you were sort of transitioning from these Victorian ideals of the collaborative authorship to modernist ideas of childhood and yeah, what kinds of arguments you're making? I'm just interested to know.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the second book started in a moment in the first book when I'm thinking about there's a chapter on child artists in Between Generations. And so I just discovered randomly this organization called the Royal Drawing Society, which, and I mentioned it briefly in the first book, it lasted from like 1880 to about 1980. So it was 100 years. And and it was an organization that is meant to encourage children's art education, but it did so through like annual exhibits of child artwork. And so as I started looking at it, and because it stretched all through like the early 20th century into the late 20th century, it survived all of these huge cultural shifts. So like the invention of the camera, changes in industry, big changes in the British Empire, World War One, modernist art movements, and I could see in the records of this organization how they were responding to all of those changes. So, for example, by the time World War One happens, many of the young boys who had exhibited their artwork in the first shows of the society were then sent to the front. And the Royal Drawing Society started to argue that they were good soldiers because they were good artists, because they had strong powers of visualization and memory. And so I discovered that the Royal Drawing Society is actually a wonderful like barometer for how children's culture is interacting with big shifts in like especially around modernism, and how that helps us theorize that children's culture is actually quite important to these moments and not like a little version of everything, but in fact that ideas of childhood really are influential in imagining how the camera works, or how do we create radical movements in art, that kids are actually part of those movements.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of T.S. Eliot's Old Possums,
Uh-huh.
which is, understood to be this outlier in the otherwise serious and grim Eliot canon, but then kind of Eliot is writing letters to his godchildren, signing the letter with old potion, or he's kind of sketching some things. And then some of the cat characters, for instance, there's this character called Macavity, which we discussed a lot in our episode, and which is based on Moriarty. So, like, how, and then I'm also thinking of Virginia Woolf's Flush, which is not a children's kidlit, but it's like still from a text from the Cocker Spaniel's point of view. So it's kind of
Yeah.
more cute than Waves or Voyage Out or something like that. So, I mean, maybe children's literature is much more of a part of modernist experimentations than we like to think.
Yeah. And actually Virginia Woolf does have a children's book called The Widow and the Parrot. And so I think a lot of modernist creators also have texts for children. Gertrude Stein did as well. And part of it, I wonder, is it because like modernism, like high modernism, like elitist modernism, like difficult modernist texts often are using childhood as a touchstone in childhood play and nonsense. So if you think of like the beginning of Portrait of an Artist as the young man, you have kind of baby talk at the beginning of that, or just the idea of play is so important to modernism. And so my task is to say, yeah, they're using childhood, but they were actually also real kids who were there. So Virginia Woolf was really close with her nephews. They created a family newspaper together. Many of those modernist artists, when they were children, created child works. And so I'm trying to think, yeah, Pablo Picasso loved child art, made stuff that looked like kids art, but he also knew real children, like including his own. And so like what happens when we try to put those imagined kids of modernism in conversation with like living young people?
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, and it happens a lot in Bengali literature as well. So there are many writers who write very, realist novels about famines and so on. They
Hmm.
also have another side where they write a lot of children's literature or young adults literature.
Hmm.
So kind of, and a lot of them also write genre fiction such as horror. So kind of this division between high modernism and writing genre fiction or children's literature or horror, that does not really hold true for, if we are kind of taking
Yeah,
into account all of their work.
yeah. And I have to say, like, I it's hard to get people in modernist studies to talk about children's literature or real childhood. And I've been to the Modernist Studies Association conference twice now. And we keep have my friend Karen Westman, who also works on children's modernism, keeps having panels like you need to look at children's literature. It's a really rich place to think about modernism, especially as modernist studies is expanding to think about pretty much everything, advertisements, jazz halls, it's just become so democratized, but childhood still seems to be this spot where they don't really want to go, or they say, "Oh no, children's like could not possibly be engaging in this way." But it is, and I
Why
want
do you
them to
think
pay
it is?
attention.
Why do you think that is?
I honestly like we just went to that conference in October, and we finished our panel. We don't know why it has remained outside, and there are people who bring them together. But I don't know if it's still just persistent assumptions that children's literature and childhood are not complex, and that a lot of early definitions of modernism I don't think are quite as current, but rely on difficulty and complexity to define that moment. Um, but as you know, children's lit can be very complicated. So
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Victoria. It was really enlightening and fun.
yeah,
Nice
It was
discussion.
really great.
Yeah.
yeah.
Lovely.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I love talking to you.
No, it is always great talking to you. So we'll stop recording now.